Today, we welcome a special guest from the East Coast, Professor Michael Como. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and Ph.D. from Stanford University. He is currently the Tōshū Fukami Associate Professor of Shinto Studies at Columbia University. His research focuses on the religious history of the Japanese islands from the Asuka period through the early Heian period, with a particular focus upon the Chinese and Korean deities, rites, and technological systems that were transmitted to the Japanese islands during this time. He is currently working on a new monograph that focuses upon urbanization and the materiality of Japanese ritual performance and interpretation in the 8th and 9th centuries. His many publications include Weaving and Binding, Immigrant Gods and Female Immortals in Ancient Japan, published by University of Hawaii Press in 2009, and the year previous to that, he published Shotoku, Ethnicity, Ritual, and Violence in the Formation of Japanese Buddhism, published by Oxford University, 2008. Professor Como has been casting his eyes toward the continent during these few years, or many years perhaps, revolutionizing in many ways the way people understand Shinto or Kami studies, much of which has been recreated after the Meiji period. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Como. I don't have the title of your talk. I'm sorry, what is the title of your talk? Oh. Yes, so the title of the talk Professor Como is going to give is called Landscapes, Soundscapes, and Angry Spirits in Ancient Japan. And let me also remind you that there are handouts in Japanese, or should I say in Chinese, or quasi-Chinese, quasi-Japanese, historical sources sitting over there if you would like to refer to those.
Can you all hear me? No. No.
Maybe.
It's
Maybe you need to.
could I just use it?
You can use this. But maybe the microphone.
That's why I've never been an FBI informant. My colleagues can rest assured.
Is that better?
How is this now?
How about you want to use this?
Yeah, that would be
Okay.
fine. Is this better? Yes. All right. All right. Well, thank you, Tomi. Thank you all for coming out today. I'm kind of astonished that this many people would come out on a Thursday at lunchtime to hear a talk on ancient Japan. I am just truly impressed and grateful. So thank you all. If you haven't picked up a handout and you are inclined to read along, please do. Part of the motivation for this handout is that I am truly pre-modern in every way and do not do good PowerPoints. But I've also seen far too many instances of what we call death by PowerPoint, when it doesn't work right when the talk is about to begin. So I thought I would use the technology of paper. And also having the Shiryo. I gave this talk last year in Japan, in Nagoya, when I was researching there. It convinces Japanese scholars that you're solid and believable and should be listened to. So let me begin. This talk, the motivation for it began, as Tomi was saying, I have been interested in trying to reconnect religion with material culture, because we have these Protestant categories that we tend to work through of the spiritual and the material, and when Buddhist monks get all involved in material gain, et cetera, they're always accused of being corrupt, et cetera. But in East Asia, religion has always been about materiality in many different ways. And there's also a material basis for religious performance. So my thought was to look at how urbanization, these tremendous changes that took place in ancient Japan, how when the material context changed, how that affected how people understand spirits and how they engage them. And what struck me in particular about what inspired this paper was I was reading an education manual for a 7-year-old boy, and the text contains, among many other things, some spells. And one of the spells is for what you should say if you hear a bell ringing while you are taking a bath. And I found that really interesting, but it also occurred to me that unless you're living in a city, you're probably not going to be hearing a bell ringing. And that just woke me up to what should be completely obvious, but it's the fact that living in an urban environment means people are now living in a new soundscape, they're not only seeing different things and touching different things, but they are hearing different sounds. So I started investigating how they interacted with spirits in ways that are related to sound. And this is what I've come up with. My apologies for reading the paper, but I wanted to get everything right and in amount of time. So this talk deals with issues from a larger project I've been working on that focuses on the materiality of performance and interpretation in Japanese religion. And two questions that drive this inquiry are, one, how did the ancient Japanese use rituals, spells, and bodily practices to interact with and shape their environment, as well as their relationship with actors in the superhuman world? And the second question is, what were the material means and contexts that made these practices both possible and meaningful? So as I adopt this approach, I'm hoping to extend my discussion such that it includes not only the ritual implements and objects of representation that were used, but also objects from daily life that enabled ritual performance. So pursuing these questions has taken me in some unexpected methodological directions. Having framed my inquiry in terms of the materiality of ritual interactions, I found myself increasingly preoccupied with the non-androcentric dimensions of ancient Japanese religion. This focus in turn has led me to resist a series of almost bedrock methodological inclinations in contemporary Japanese religious studies that lead us to focus almost entirely on human actors as religious agents. This focus is perhaps most apparent in discussions of ritual that examine it almost exclusively in terms of what humans would request, declare, promise in liturgies, or what they would pray, etc. Today, by contrast, much of my discussion will focus on humans conceived of possible responses to their actions and how they understood the material forms that those responses could take. In other words, today I'd like to ask the question, what did the kami in ancient Japan want? And how did they go about asking for it? So one virtue of this approach is that it helps clarify the degree to which religious actors in ancient Japan took for granted the agency, not only of deities, spirits, and Buddhas, but also the material objects that mediated human and superhuman interactions. In other words, I want to take seriously the fact that in ancient Japan, non-human agents, whether spirits or material objects, were regularly seen to initiate interactions with human beings. Thus, in contrast to a widespread tendency to portray early rulers of the Japanese islands as innovators and initiators of religious and political programs, I'd like to suggest that these same rulers were to a remarkable degree reactive agents, responding to events and signs that they believed originated from non-human actors. One further consequence of this emphasis on the materiality of ritual performance is that it helps illuminate how changes in the material environment of ancient Japan could dramatically affect the nature of religious performances and understandings. This is immediately relevant for our discussion in light of the enormous changes to the material environment that accompanied Japan's 8th century urbanization. During this 100-year period, Japanese rulers built no fewer than 6 capitals, with the Nara capital housing somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 residents. To give you some comparison, before the first capital was built, there had never been a city in Japan with more than 5,000 people in it. Although the resources consumed in the construction and maintenance of these capitals irrevocably transformed the natural landscape of much of central Japan, my discussion today will focus primarily on how living in an urban landscape affected modes of interaction between humans, spirits, and the material world. In what follows, we shall see that the newly constructed urban landscapes generated new ritual and experiential contexts for the bureaucrats, ritualists, courtiers, and artisans that inhabited the capitals. So I will be arguing that when seen in this light, the buildings, roads, and material culture of the capital were far more than simple inert matter. Rather, they functioned as active forces that helped shape the ritual concerns for anyone who lived there. Finally, I found that focusing on the material dimensions of ritual performance also requires taking seriously the embodied nature of ritual actors. Today, I'll be discussing this dimension in terms of the new soundscape of the built environments. Focusing on the aural dimensions of urban life, surprisingly, provides an excellent point of entry into understanding how the new physical experiences generated by living in a built environment helped shape the ritual strategies and interpretive frameworks of urban residents. As it turns out, understanding religious behavior becomes much easier once we come to our senses. Now, each of the topics I've just outlined, figuring out what the kami of ancient Japan wanted from humans, examining how the built environment of Japanese cities shaped the ritual concerns of urban dwellers, and assessing the role of urban soundscapes in ancient Japanese religious life. Each of these could easily serve as the subject matter for one or several monographs. Somewhat counterintuitively, however, I'm going to attempt to do all three by focusing upon events that highlight each of these 3 spheres. In other words, whereas the area covered by each of these dimensions separately is quite vast, the area circumscribed just by their intersection, though surprisingly robust, is much more circumscribed. So I therefore propose to discuss this more limited area by A, briefly describing some of the most important ritual consequences of the capital building spree, B, discussing how the kami of Japan communicated with the Japanese court by means of Tatari, or we usually translate this as vengeance, and C, tracing changes that occurred in omens that were sound specific, what I call aural anomalies, from the 7th through the 9th centuries. In so doing, I hope to show that the emergence of the new material contexts generated by urbanization produced profound changes for the ancient Japanese as they developed new modes of communicating with spirits and new ways of listening to their world. Okay, before jumping into all of this, I'd like to first give, in place of a definition of urbanization, 6 characteristics that I think are particularly salient for understanding the phenomenon of urbanization in general and ancient Japan in particular. So they are: 1, cities involve consumption of extraordinary amounts of resources, not only at the time of their construction, but throughout their existence, as large numbers of people living in a densely packed environment require the continuous importation of food, wood, and basic materials for existence. 2, cities always involve movement. This means basically the movement of large numbers of people. The Nara capital, as I said, had somewhere between 70 to 100,000 people, and the Heian capital had roughly the same, if not more. But this also means the continuous movement of material goods and objects needed to feed, clothe, and house these residents. Urbanization thus requires the development of extended transportation networks that manifest physically in the form of roadways, canals, and bridges to house travelers. 3, cities involve disruption. This disruption is not limited to the area within the city limits, but extends to the surrounding regions that take on the role of supplying new urban residents with their material needs. Old relationships to the land, natural resources, as well as the structures of social institutions predicated upon the close proximity of participants to the land, have to be modified or replaced. Managing this disruption is a primary spur for the development of bureaucratic structures of control that regulate the extraction and transformation of materials from the social and geographic peripheries to the urban core. 4, cities produce aftershocks. By this, I mean secondary consequences that result from the movements and disruptions of urbanization in human society. These effects also, however, necessarily extend beyond the human realm. On the macro level, this can involve the disruption of natural environmental conditions related to forests that are clear-cut for timber, mountains that are mined for water, metal, and waterways that are dammed to control flooding. On the micro level, this can be seen in the creation of new hosts and modes of transport for microbes that can then spread into new areas with often lethal effect. 5, cities also produce dislocation and relocation. Although this can be seen most obviously at the site of the new capital, where one physical and cultic environment is essentially erased, and a new one imploded over it, it is crucial to understand that this dislocation can extend to a far greater geographic sphere and reach even the realm of the superhuman world. In ancient Japan, the movement of large numbers of people into small, densely populated urban centers helped spur the movement of their related kami and ancestors. In particular, the destruction of forest habitats where the kami were believed to descend to earth, and the relocation from the traditional sites where the worship of ancestors was undertaken, meant that the residents of capitals during the Nara period faced unprecedented questions concerning where and how to engage spirits. For similar reasons, new issues of where and how to bury the dead also came to the fore. All right. Those are the main characteristics that I think we need to bear in mind for urbanization for this talk at any rate. Now, although the political motivations and consequences of the capital building spree have been discussed at length by Japanese historians, there's been surprisingly little discussion on the religious study side of how this process transformed ritual practice. And when it has happened, scholars have contented themselves to pointing out the cosmological presuppositions from classical Chinese texts that were embedded in the structure of early Japanese cities. But there's been surprisingly little attention paid to the question of how the construction of capitals required extensive use of ritual as well as technological tools for transforming wilderness into a suitable site for the emperor. This process began even before construction commenced, as mantic rites, geomancy, were necessary to determine the optimal site for the capital. And large-scale construction further required a series of rituals designed to placate the deities of the earth, who were presumed to be offended by the extensive disturbances of the ground, as well as local deities that would be upset by the loss of trees and other raw materials that were necessary for the construction of roads and buildings. And as we'll see in a few minutes, these rites do not seem to have always worked, with the result that the court frequently had to deal with angry, vengeful spirits upset with the disruption of the areas that they had frequented. Creating a capital for the ruler also required an elaborate ritual agenda designed to demarcate the borders of the capital. This was done in part with the construction of physical objects, such as gates, canals, roads, and temples that established physical barriers and borders of the capital. Each of these barriers were in turn also inextricably linked with programs of ritual performance. On the roadways at crucial transport nodes outside the capital, for instance, the Michiai no Matsuri, the rite of roadside offerings, was undertaken twice annually. Beginning in the 9th century within the palace, the rite of the obeisances of the four directions, the Shihohai, was undertaken with a similar goal of establishing a ritual perimeter within the palace that would keep the ruler safe. At the main gate of the palace, the rite of great purification, the Oharai, was also performed twice yearly, as well as at any time of ritual danger. Again with the goal of cleansing the capital of noxious spiritual influences and preventing the creation of threatening spirits. Although each of these rites, as well as others, have been discussed at length in terms of what they reveal about the court's overall ritual program, what I'd like to suggest today is that the built structures and objects at these and other sites may, over time, have come to be seen as possessing latent ritual efficacy in their own right. Although these rites could be used for a variety of purposes, they primarily functioned as rites of purification and exorcism. Frequently, these rites involved the use of ritual implements such as scapegoat dolls, or hitogata, clay vessels, often painted with the faces of angry spirits, as well as clay effigies of animals such as horses, chickens, and cows. Archaeological evidence suggests that whereas at the start of the 8th century such rites were mainly the purview of religious specialists, by the end of the Nara period they were being commonly used by members of the populace at large. Evidence for this includes not only a substantial increase in the number of ritual implements that are found from the latter end of the period, but also from the location of these finds. Whereas the earliest finds have been concentrated in a small number of sites, such as at the main gate of the palace, later finds include a wider variety of objects in varied shapes and sizes that are dispersed at crossroads all around the capital. In other words, it appears highly likely that from the 8th century, both the popularity of such rites as well as their material culture spread rapidly in urban centers and beyond. Although the discussions of these rites are going to be beyond the bounds of my talk today, I do want to note here that the upsurge in their popularity coincided with the development of new modes of interpreting aural phenomena, and that I will talk about later on. Rites of exorcism and purification came to be seen as a necessity brought about by the belief that the new urban environment of the capital, with its high population density, was prone to producing large amounts of impurities, or kegare, and hence needed regularized rites for purification. Equally importantly, however, was the possibility of producing angry deities that were disturbed when the court pushed out pre-existing spirits from a given region in order to construct a new capital. Among the principal flashpoints of such anger were forests and tombs. Forests in particular came to be sources of conflict in ancient Japan because spirits were believed to descend there in order to receive offerings, and because these were in turn literally the very stuff that cities were made out of. So urbanization and the clear-cutting of forests carried with it always a strong potential for disrupting pre-existing environments and for creating danger. Closely related to the concept of anomalies in ancient Japan is the concept of Tatari, which is generally understood as vengeance or retribution inflicted upon humans by an angry spirit. Often, though not always, Tatari was thought to have been manifested in the form of epidemics that would sweep across the populace, or even the illness or death of rulers and those close to them. Scholars such as Oe Atsushi, however, have been careful to point out that the deities of ancient Japan were believed to use Tatari primarily as a means of expressing their displeasure with a situation for which they required redress. Within our earliest textual sources, such as the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, and local gazetteers known collectively as Fudoki, There are some 11 accounts which are specifically labeled as instances of Tatari. Now, although Tatari was long seen as an ancient and timeless constant in Japanese religion by traditionalist scholars of Japanese Shinto, today I'd like to suggest that a close look at these instances shows a consistent correlation with the forces of urbanization. These, I think, can be seen very clearly in 8 of the 11 cases that we have that the court specifically designated as Tatari. And I will not go through all of them, but I will say that these are significant because they point out the basic process of interacting with the spirits, which is the first thing that has to happen is a divination has to be done to understand which kami is angry and why. So anomalies, though often painful, have to be seen within a context of interactions between the human and superhuman world. Divination was essential for properly understanding the nature of a given event and, far more importantly, what was being demanded by the god. Further, inherent in all of the stories we see, well, in the large majority of the stories that we see between in Tatari, we see the conception of human beings reacting to the kami who initiate the interaction. Communication was very much a two-way street within early Japanese religion. Anomalies produce ritual action. First, obviously, in the form of divination, but secondly, in more extensive interactions between humans and kami that are themselves ritually mediated. And finally, what I'd like to point out is that almost all of these instances can be related to urbanization that occurred in ancient Japan. These instances of Tatari break down fundamentally into 2 groups. First, we find legends which show court officials clearing land in the provinces to extend the imperial reach, and then incurring the kami's wrath as they destroy the habitats in which the kami were thought to descend and receive offerings. What we find in these accounts is that travelers on the roadway are often killed, but we also see accounts in which the construction of palaces itself can bring on the immediate danger and even death to emperors. So if you look at the on the handout, the second account shows how the Empress Saime was killed by a spirit because she built a palace and workers cut down the kami's trees. More frequently, however, we see a second type of Tatari narrative in which the Tatari deity is seeking the attention of court because it wishes to have a shrine built for it. In many ways, these stories are a more extended version of narratives of displacement. Prior to the last quarter of the 7th century, that is to say until roughly the time of the construction of the first capital, shrines to the kami of Japan rarely took the form of built structures. Instead, the vast majority were just areas set aside in nature where kami were thought to be able to easily descend into a natural object such as a tree or a boulder in order to receive offerings. Although there are frequent references within the early texts for the construction of temporary buildings for the worship of kami or spirits of the dead, the number of shrines that are known to have had permanent buildings dedicated to them in late 7th century Japan is remarkably small. These stories, therefore, reflect an important turning point in the history of Japanese religion that was spurred by urbanization. In effect, what we see is that with urbanization, the kami of Japan for the first time began demanding not only food offerings, but also housing. Set against this backdrop, the disruption of natural habitats appears to be a response, and the legends of Tatari that occur with them appears to be a response to the inevitable jostling and displacement that occurred in the superhuman world in the realm, in the aftermath of urbanization. From this point onward, buildings and fixed domiciles for both humans and spirits take on an increasing importance for Japanese religious life. All right, now for the remainder of this paper, I'd like to turn to the issue of how the emergence of new urban soundscapes and landscapes helped shape and structure interactions between the human and superhuman world. As I noted in the introduction, this takes the form of an extended discussion of aural anomalies. Anomalies are of immediate importance for understanding the processes of change because they are, by definition, not planned. They force improvisation and response, and they reveal presuppositions underlying the court's understanding of the relationship between the human and superhuman world that could not be gleaned simply from a structural examination of court rites, I've lost my place here. That could not be gleaned from a structural examination of court rites or pronouncements. Anomalies, as we've also seen, are drivers of ritual. Once an anomaly appears, it needs to be understood, which is to say it entails divination. Very often, the result of the divination is further ritual propitiation of spirits. And finally, anomalies also reveal the sites where the superhuman world was believed to intersect with the human world. Now, throughout this section, I'd like to refer to roughly 70 entries from the national histories that I have found that provide a sort of appendix to this paper. I won't address all 70 of them, don't worry, but what I'd like to just show you is this happened all the time. These anomalies were pervasive. But I'd like to, if I may, approach a few of these in terms of their individual specificity. For heuristic purposes, I've subdivided these into 3 groups, which I will address in turn. And I've divided them in terms of just chronological order. So in the first part, I'd like to discuss aural anomalies that occurred, that are recorded for the years up until the year 670, which is when the reign of Emperor Tenmu, the ruler who planned but did not build the first capital. During this period, engineering and architectural technologies from the Korean peninsula began to spread in the Japanese islands, primarily in the vicinity of the court. In the second part, I will very briefly discuss aural anomalies that are recorded from the years 670 to 770. This is the period where urbanization gets underway, and it is also the period in which the line of Tenmu and his descendants held the throne. Finally, I will then discuss the aural anomalies that were recorded from the years 770 to 888. This covers the period of years, this covers the rule of the enormously consequential Emperor Kammu up through the 100 years that follow the construction of the Nagaoka and then Heian capitals. And it is also the period that is covered by the national histories. I can't go any further than that with the histories because there aren't any more. All right, so let's begin with the pre-670 anomalies. On your handout, I haven't listed any events that appear in the mythological chapters of, say, the Nihon Shoki, but beginning with the Jinmu chapter, the first human emperor, what we find is that there are actually very few anomalies related to sound. I've listed all of them in group 1 on the handout. And I'll just make a few observations here today. Within this group of anomalies, we can find that they can be divided into 2 subgroups. The first subgroup, which are, I think, entries 3, 5, and 6, the texts clearly indicate that the omens under discussion are the result of direct actions of the kami. We find in them a voice in the sky appears in the Richu chapter, or a miraculous cry came from a bird. Or similarly, we find heavenly music appears that seems to be the work of Buddhist deities accompanying the advent of the first Buddhist daikon to the Japanese islands. Each of these events is also set in the past, with the latest coming in the mid-6th century. So the very, very earliest anomalies are kami directly speaking, and they occur up to the 6th century. The remaining 15 anomalies, once we get to the 7th century, are all of a somewhat different type. To begin with, they occur beginning with and through the period when craftsmen from the Korean peninsula began arriving in the Japanese islands in order to transmit knowledge of continental systems for building, architecture, engineering, and divination. And these were all predicated upon principles of five phases thought, the interaction of the five phases in Chinese cosmology. And I would suggest that this process is reflected in the types of omens that we find during this period. That is to say, beginning in the 7th century, discussions of anomalies in the court no longer involve voices in the sky from kami, but rather focus upon giving information related to the time, place, and direction that would be necessary for doing five phases interpretation of anomalies. So now we're doing a different type of divination. All of this suggests that already in the 7th century, the influence of five phases thought was spreading not only among the engineers and architects that were building the temples, but also among at least a small number of people who were beginning to engage their material environment in different ways. Okay, before concluding my discussion of group one, I'd like to make two final points. The first is that with one exception, these anomalies are all focused upon sounds that can be found in nature. Animals crying, shooting stars, voice in the sky, etc. Second, with the exception of the legend of the appearance of the Buddha image, each of these instances are local. That is to say, they are said to have occurred in extremely close proximity to the court. So when taken together, the anomalies from group one suggest that during the 7th century, important shifts were already underway in the area around the court, where court officials and craftsmen were now seeking to understand anomalous phenomena and engage the superhuman world in new ways related to five phases thought. However rapidly such modes of engagement may have been spreading in the area around the court, however, we can also say that there is almost no evidence that they had spread to distant provinces, and natural phenomena continue to be the main objects of observation. All right, now we get to phase two, 670 to 769. All right, in group two, we have a group of aural anomalies. These are only aural anomalies that I'm giving. And there are only 7 of them, almost all of which again involve natural phenomena. Some are thought to be the work of kami, but most are interpreted in terms of five phases thought. The one exception of this case can be seen in anomaly number 23, where we are told that the storehouse in the treasury itself gives off an anomalous sound. This case is notable in that the source of the anomaly is a court building, not an object from nature. Overall, however, the two strongest impressions generated by this group are A, broad continuity with the anomalies from the previous century, and B, the somewhat dramatic decline in the number of recorded anomalies. And then we get to group 3, when all hell breaks loose. The decline in the recorded number of aural anomalies from group 2 was abruptly reversed beginning in the year 770. In this year, Konnin Tenno ascended the throne, paving the way some 10 years later for his son Kammu, one of the most consequential rulers in Japanese history. For our purposes, Kammu is of immediate note because A, he built not one but 2 capitals, B, he transformed much of state ritual along Chinese lines, and C, he reignited an almost interminable war with the Amishi people in northeastern Japan. As we shall see momentarily, each of these developments exerted a lasting impact on the development of Heian period religion. Perhaps the best indication of just how dramatically these events affected Heian religious culture can be seen in the stark contrast between the 8 examples of aural anomalies that we found for the years 670 to 769, and the over 200 such anomalies that occurred between 770 and 788. This latter period is thus remarkable if for no other reason than the sheer volume of anomalies that were being recorded. Equally remarkably, however, these omens also suggest a dramatic shift in how the residents of the Japanese islands were relating to their environment. Because I'm primarily interested in the nature of this shift. In group 3, I haven't given you 200 cases. I've restricted myself to 40 such incidents from the period that focus upon sounds emanating only from built structures. Structures that the court and people around them themselves had built. Within this group of 40 anomalies, several themes emerge. First, several of these anomalies appear to reflect a belief that the health of the ruler was directly tied to or reflected by the status of the built structures that symbolized his rule. This can be seen clearly in a series of events that occurred shortly before Konin's death in 781. As Konin's health deteriorated, the court appears to have increasingly focused on mysterious sounds emanating from the barrier gates and warehouses in Ise and Mino provinces. So we get entries such as this. 26th day, 3rd month, 1st year of Tenno. The military storehouse in the Tomada district sounded and moved. It then sounded and moved 4 times again as before. Its sound was like thunder and it shook slightly. Ise province reported that this month on the 16th day at noon, the drum at the western central gate at the Suzuka barrier sounded. It sounded 3 times. 4th month, 1st year. The weapons in the left and right military storehouses sounded on their own. The sound was like great boulders being thrown to the ground. Tajihi Mashito Migami of the junior lower 5th rank was sent to Ise. Otomo Tsukune Tsuguhito of the junior lower 5th rank and governor of Hoki was sent to Mino. And the Fujiwara Ason Sugatsugu of the junior lower 5th rank and assistant secretary of the War Department was sent to Echizen to secure the barriers. This was done to protect the emperor's health. 3rd day, 4th month, 1st year. Emperor Konin cedes the throne to his son Kammu. 23rd day, 12th month, Emperor Konin dies. 26th day, 12th month, the south building in the military storehouse and the eastern storehouse sounded. There can be little doubt that the editors of this text intended for their readers to understand that the Suzuka Barrier Gate, which was a strategic bulwark for the defense of northeastern Japan, as well as the military storehouses of the capital, directly resonated with the fate of Emperor Konin. The barriers are secured, after all, quote, because of the emperor's sickness. As if to underline the point even further, we are also told that Konin's abdication and then death literally shakes these buildings to their foundations, just as the foundations of the state are shaken. Other anomalies were interpreted as being direct messages or threats from the kami. Thus in 806, a series of aural anomalies that emerged together with other phenomena, such as an eclipse and the outbreak of mountain fires, was attributed to the wrath of the deities of the Kamo shrines. In the 21st year of the 3rd month of the 21st day, 3rd month of 1st year of Daido, we read, the sun was red and without rays. The military storehouse sounded. This evening there was a lunar eclipse. 2 days later, on this day the sun was red and without rays. Fire broke out in Oi, Hie, Ono, and the Kurisuno mountains, and the capital was dark in midday. It was reported that the site of the royal tomb was too close to the Kamo shrine. Can we doubt that the fires and disasters were caused by the shrine? Thus it was decided to have a divination done, with the result that it was the Tatari of the shrine. 7th day, 4th month, 1st year. Emperor Kammu was interned in the Kashiwara tomb in Yamashiro province in Ki district. So here we see that the gods of the Kamo shrines were believed to have been unhappy that a tomb of the recently deceased Kammu had been located too close to their shrines. This type of Tatari-based sound anomaly was not at all uncommon. when a tower at the Iwashimizu shrine suddenly gave off sounds like thunder in 886. For instance, the Jingi Khan, the Ministry of Rites, declared that the god Hachiman was communicating his displeasure by the means of shaking the wooden structures of his shrines. A third and final type of aural anomaly for the built environment that I'd like to discuss was related not to the health of the ruler, but rather the defense of the realm. I call these anomalies of war. Almost half of all the aural anomalies from Group 3 are of this type. Somewhat astoundingly, these anomalies of war were typically produced by military storehouses and or the drums, bells, and weapons inside of them. Anomalies of war became particularly prominent during a period of sustained military tensions following the accession of Emperor Seiwa at the start of the Jogan era in 856. This period showed not only great military tension, but this is also a period when we have military uprisings from the Amishi people in northern Japan. In this context, it's hardly surprising that in 20 years following Seiwa's accession to the throne, we find multiple reports of aural anomalies emanating from storehouses, averaging more than one every 2 years. To give but a few examples. In the 13th day, 6th month of the 12th year of Jogan, Dazaifu in Kyushu reports, in Hizen province, the military storehouses shook. The drums sounded twice. Milfoil and plastron divinations determined that neighboring armies should be monitored. On this day, an imperial edict was sent to Chikuzen, Hizen, Iki, and Taima provinces, telling them to be vigilant but not to fear. 15th day, 1st month of the 13th year, Dazaifu reported, the drums in the military storehouses on Ikishima sounded. 17th day, 7th month, 14th year, Totomi province reported that its military storehouse sounded. Sound was like hammering on a drum. 20th day, 6th month, 17th year of Jogan. Dazaifu reported 2 large birds flew onto the storehouse at Tamana district in Higo province. They faced west and cried out. A flock of several hundred crows then tore out the moss covering the buildings of the Kikuike district storehouse. Anomalies such as these, when taken together, thus suggest that by the end of the 9th century, a rather remarkable shift had occurred in some of the most basic means by which the people of the Japanese islands engaged their material environment as well as the superhuman world. Whereas records from the aural anomalies of the 7th century were almost invariably focused upon natural objects, and they occurred only within a very small area around the court. Here we see that by the first third of the Heian era, courtiers, craftsmen, and provincials from across the Japanese islands, from all the way from Kyushu in the south to Dewa in the north, were listening intently to buildings that they themselves had built in the hopes of gaining insight into the will of the kami and the health of the ruler and the security of the realm. These accounts demonstrate the extensive degree to which these phenomena had become interwoven into the political and religious life of the realm. Here we see that when anomalies did occur, messages were sent from even the most distant provinces immediately to the capital, where they were referred to divination experts in the court's Ministry of Rites and in the Bureau of Yin and Yang for interpretation. And often such messages resulted in further ritual activity as well as military orders that were then sent from the capital to other extremely distant provinces. In this sense, a single loud sound emanating from a warehouse in Dazaifu could resonate all the way to Dewa, spanning the entire country, spanning the entirety of the nation. Equally dramatically, these anomalies also illustrate just how far the religious imagination of the people of the Japanese islands had shifted in the roughly 200 years from the construction of the first capital to the end of the 9th century. Here we see that rather than focusing exclusively on divine voices in the sky or sounds from nature, the Japanese of the 9th century were also turning to mundane material objects for help in understanding the superhuman realm and how superhuman beings revealed themselves in our world. Simply put, it would appear that as palaces, barrier gates, and warehouses increasingly shaped the landscape of ancient Japan, the ancient Japanese responded by developing new ways of listening to their world, both mundane and divine. Thank you very much.
So you need this.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Barbara will. So we can take questions. Barbara will run around and give you the microphone. You will. Anybody?
Do you have any examples of how far reaching that military change was, so that they hear about these things that are happening and, oh, we got to send all these troops over here?
Mm-hmm.
Was it really that extensive?
Yes, absolutely. They at this time they're worried about these Amishi people in the north, and they're also worried about pirates from Shilla in the south. And yes, they absolutely do send out edicts saying to governors saying, you have to put everyone on red alert, because somewhere in some other part of the country, one of our buildings made a sound. One of the buildings, I mean, this is a very geeky talk, and to get to this, you have to go through a lot of examples that individually don't seem like they say much. But if you put it together in aggregate, something really that I do not understand has happened, such that they're building warehouses and such. A sound comes from them, and they go, whoa, what does that mean? And yes, across the Japanese islands. Yes. Earthquakes, I haven't dealt with them. Earthquakes are absolutely a different type of anomaly. They're seen as disasters. They're obviously of a natural order, so they're not a focus of my paper. But yes, absolutely, the earthquakes are seen as being signs of extensive displeasure, usually with the ruler. When you get to the late Heian and medieval period, this becomes a very, very hot topic of debate and discussion among Omyodo circles of yin-yang diviners. I don't have that much more to say about them right now, though.
So during this 200-year time span, the diviners for the court had pretty lucrative jobs. Were they always busy trying to interpret all these things coming across from all over the country?
Lucrative? They had jobs. Let's say it that way. So I mean, to be a bureaucrat living in the capital already means you have a certain rank, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. You're not doing corvée labor, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the amount of ritual activity at the court, we can't say definitively, because we don't have their logs, like 15 anomalies checked today, and the summer is the off season for anomalies. We don't have that. We can't tell. And another problem that we do have is that some rulers are very, very interested in making sure that people don't hear about what's happening. So, like, you can't just, if you report an anomaly, you have to report it in secret to particular officials who then communicate it to the Divination Bureau. So it's hard to know. Having said that, my sense is that well, first let me preface this by saying I think we've completely misunderstood ancient Japanese religion in a lot of ways. But one way that I think we've misunderstood it is, I don't think in the 7th and early 8th century they're all that interested in the kami. And to the degree that they are, they just want them to stay away. If you don't bother us, we won't bother you. It only starts to shift in the late 8th century when you get, ironically, this Kamu. He sees himself as a Chinese type ruler, and Chinese rulers do engage spirits with particular sets of rites, and he starts instituting these rites, especially for his imperial ancestors. And once that happens, once you start dealing with them, you piss them off, and you get all sorts of Tatari. So that's part of why you get this explosion, I think.
I was actually going to ask exactly about that, which is in how far are the changes that you're describing a result of urbanization, and how far is this really an extension of the earlier, I guess, engagement with 5 phases cosmology, and that the examples that you're talking about are about the creation of new types of ritual spaces, the capital and the palace, right, which are laid out like a cosmograph in the manner of Chinese. And so it appears that by the creation of this new kind of ritual space are also created new types of ritual problems. Right, so the question is this really a matter of urbanization in general, or is it really the result of a specific introduction of a specific kind of new ritual space?
All right. Well, if you look at, say, the structure of the capital, yes, there are ritual spaces which are created in that sense. But from my point of view, when I talk about aftershocks, say, what I'm interested in and what I rather strongly believe is that what's happening is that there are material byproducts from even constructing the first temple in Japan, right? You can call a temple a ritual space. But if you look at the entry for the construction of Asuka Dera in, 604, I guess. If you look at it, you see, you can read it and say, oh, okay, all the court assembled. This is a political moment. People talk about that. And this is the beginning of Buddhism. But if you look more closely, you notice that it's done on the 15th day of the first month, which is, and they state, and then the pillar is put in the 16th day. Now, if you know the Chinese ritual calendar, you would say that's exactly when they should be doing it. And they also say that they put relics, and we know from archaeological work, and all sorts of other spirit-quelling items at the base of the pillar. So what's happened? You have some engineers from Pekche who have come over. That's also recorded in the text. And they're there in order to build a temple. And the court wants it because they want Buddhism. But by bringing Buddhism over, they also bring over a certain type of material culture, which they're not really prepared to sustain. They need people from Pekche. And those engineers come over and they say, you're going to put a pillar in the ground. The best time to do it is 16th day of the first month. We'll wait till then. And even today in Taiwan or China, you build a building, you first do a divination, you figure out what the right day is, right? And then you're going to be disturbing the earth deities. So you have to put something in the ground for them. So we're generating ritual activity, and we're also introducing new understandings of spirits independently of the structure of the temple or what it's meant for. So what's happening with the capital is you see this over and over and over again. This text that I read, I alluded to at the beginning, talking about a spell for what to say when you're taking a bath and hear a bell ringing, right? I love that text. It's a text which is written for a 7-year-old boy by one of the leading intellectuals of the day. And it's designed, specifically, he says in the preface, I want to tell him everything he needs to know to be a successful courtier. And since he's only 7 years old, he's just giving him common sense. This is just the important stuff. If you read through the text, you do not find the gods of imperial mythology. What you find are all sorts of Chinese deities, the god of the hearth, Omyodo, and you find Buddhist deities, and very, very practical advice about what to do when you take a bath. What days can you take medicine? When do you put a pillar into a ground? When do you erase it? That is the type of religion that I call these deities stowaway gods, that comes into Japan not because they're deliberately imported and the court doesn't care about them. They don't show up very much in, or if at all, in the mythology. But that is the type of, these are the types of gods. This is the world that people lived in, and these are the gods they actually live with. And these are who they are listening to, and I think for much of this.
Yeah, great. So thank you so much for the super interesting talk, and I really appreciated the studio and the kind of longer historical sweep of what you're talking about. At the same time, it made me think a lot about things that happen afterwards in terms of this maybe relationship between something like sovereignty or ritual and sound. And I'm thinking about things that happen later on in terms of descriptions of Dengaku or and Genji, and the tale of Genji in particular. And there it seems to me in a very different way that might be helpful maybe to thinking about kind of what sound does and why it becomes important. It seems to be really connected to feelings of disdain or kind of insecurity or concerns about sovereignty. So for instance, when Genji's in this kind of haunted house, which, is itself based on these kind of Chinese precedents and so forth.
This is Yugao?
This is in Yugao, chapter, right? And there's sound is very much about, first of all, like lower class labor, right? And the sound that's marked as not just sound but noise is really the sound of, that's kind of entering without being able to, without Genji's kind of permission, right? So it's this kind of destabilizing thing. And at the same time, when he's in exile later on, he's exposed to all of this kind of less than aristocratic kind of noise again. And it just seems to me that, this is a context in which everything is so built up that there's a different kind of noise, and it's not now the noise of kind of spirits per se, which is in some ways much more naturalized at this point, right? There's, kind of chanting Dharani and so forth to get rid of spirits and exercise, but there's a different kind of sound that's in these architectural spaces that's very much about kind of being reminded of some kind of insecurity or kind of dispossession. And I was just wondering how, these things might be related to one another, and I think one of the things is the directionality potentially, or the kind of the way in which sound penetrates the body that might actually kind of be a way to kind of connect some of the things that are more kind of related to divination and then these other kind of what we might call kind of status concerns or kind of sovereignty concerns.
Well, there's a lot in that question. Actually, one thing that occurs to me is if I recall correctly, in the Yugao chapter, I think when they go into that house, Genji particularly notices the gate, and he finds it foreboding in some way. I forget, when I was a grad student, which is to say, just slightly after the Genji was written, I do remember something about the Japanese in there, but the way it's written is that the gate is like actively exerting some influence on Genji. It seems to have some sort of agency, but that happens after 1000, and I'm a historian, I'm not a journalist, so I don't do things after 1000. No, I don't know enough to say about mid-late Heian and how this is taken. And it can be taken in, I think what I would like to say is it can be taken in any number of ways. But I would like to sort of push back a little bit on the tendency to try and intellectualize or give an ideological reading to these types of experiences. You can talk about Tatari and all that and talk about how it functions ideologically, et cetera, et cetera. But it's important to remember that they really believe that Empress Saimei built a palace, they cut down some trees, and she died. They really believe that Emperor Tenmu asked to see the sword from the Kusanagi shrine. It cursed him. We're told the sword curses him, and he dies. Right? Now, those two events happen within 30 years of each other, and less than 30 years but roughly 30 years in Tenmu's case, from the writing of the Nihon Shoki. So this is like current events from their point of view. And so there is a basic level of they really believe that this does work. Now, so I don't know if it's about, it can be about kingship in some ways. I mean, clearly it is when you think, well, this is reflecting, this is an imperial gate and this must be reflecting the ruler. But for me, what is interesting is it's not simply rulers and religious professionals who are listening in this way. You have some, low-ranking military official hear something in Hoki, some way out of the way province, and it gets reported and it has an immediate impact upon all sorts of things. So I'm content to stay at a fairly simple level, sort of like a gut level as to how this is working. But yes, I'm sure it was theorized, especially as time goes on, it's theorized in more and more ways. I don't know if that gets to what you're going for. Okay. Ben?
No.
Mm-hmm.
This is all very inauspicious. It seems as though every sound that people hear is interpreted as bringing some kind of ill omen.
Yeah.
And to that extent, it's familiar to me from the Chinese context. But in the Chinese context, you also have the opposite of that, which you have these very auspicious sound omens and other kinds of omens. And are those absent here, or?
There are one or two. There is one empress who gives birth to a boy, and we're told that there was thunder in the sky in response to that. The implication is a response to that. I read it as, especially the insecurity, the military insecurity that they're feeling. Yeah, I read it as they don't like things that are too out of place. And the other thing is, and maybe Reggie can talk more about this in terms of the literary sphere, but they don't like things that are loud. They really don't like things that are loud. There's one courtier diary from the late 10th century in which, you have like the minister of the right talking, and there was a big thunderstorm, a big storm. So all the ministers, they all have to come to the palace and stand at attention, presumably to protect the ruler. And he's like, the minister of the left was just shaking. He was just so scared, but I wasn't scared of the thunder because I'm a devoted Buddhist. So they just don't like loud noises, I think. I think that's really just part of it. But I also think, more generally, they don't like the gods of Japan. They don't like the kami. And the purpose of having a Jingi-kan is to make sure the emperor doesn't have to deal with them. All the textbooks that say, the Jingi-kan is there to connect the ruler to the gods. No, they would have been delighted if they didn't ever have to deal with them. One way you can see that is when they build a capital, we talk about, like, say, when they built the Nagaoka capital, they didn't allow Buddhist temples to be built inside. And we all say, oh, this is a very, very anti-Buddhist moment. In the Nara capital, and none of the 6 capitals that they built in the 8th century, do they allow any Shinto shrines? No. So the gods are all being put outside. Far away is fine, as far as they're concerned. So I think just in general, anytime they're dealing with these gods, they're putting out a fire pretty much, unless it's the imperial ancestors.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. What I would like to ask about is the the response of this sound. So it seems like the way that the gods represent themselves more became like a soundscape and more became like a aural sounds. And I was wondering like how people who perceived this response, this aural response from the god, was like responding to this religious the new way of like represented gods. So like for example, you gave us a lot of examples about how the gods were representing themselves through these like sounds and the movings of these buildings. And then I was wondering, like when the emperor was like sending this like his people to make the gods like more like comfort, is that involves like more of the sounds compared to the previous like ritual practice, or and it seems like there should be some difference in like performance ways or the religious like ritual ways that the people respond to the gods who's using a different like system of their responses to the people. So I was wondering about that.
Okay, so I'm not quite. Could you give me like a one sentence summary of your question?
I think I'm more curious about like how people like how these people responded to these religious gods who's using more of a sound, like along with the urbanization, it seems like gods are using more of the sounds to represent themselves. And then if this the way that that gods are changing their way of communicating with the people, with the not with the humans, then how humans changed their way of ritual performances to communicate with this non-human like existences.
Right. That's a great question. It's very, very hard to get at that with the written sources that we have, simply because the court wasn't all that interested in the common people either. One hint of that is, like, say if I mentioned this text, Kujizusami, and someone, if you're taking a bath and you hear a bell ringing, this is the spell that you use. Okay, if you look at that spell, it's not a spell that was created in China. It comes out as like a waka poem, actually. So we're seeing an urban event, an urban phenomenon, and people have created a spell to say in response to it. So my immediate inclination is there was probably a lot of oral responses to this sort of thing. People chanting in Nembutsu, say, once you get into the 10th century, or other Buddhist or non-Buddhist spells. And then beyond that, it's hard to say. There is a lot of ritual activity we can see going on. I mentioned it in the talk, where, say, at the beginning of the 8th century, we only start to see use of all of these ritual dowels, etc. And by the end of the 8th century, there are a lot of them, and there are a lot of ritual implements that we don't really know what they're doing, because this is a popular religious practice, but it's not something that the court does. And because it's not something the court does, we don't know. No one theorizes it, no one records it, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems that there are a lot of rites designed to just keep spirits away, blocking them. You go to the roadways and block them from coming in. That's all I can say. That's all I know for right now.
This is sort of totally different. And it may be harking back to the example you gave of kami, or spirits, descending, occupying some sort of object of nature, a boulder, a tree, whatever, temporarily, and then leaving.
Right.
And I may be using, sort of contemporary categories to try to understand this, but I'm trying to imagine what the sort of personality profile of a kami might be in people's minds, and I can imagine sort of two interrelated axes we could talk about. One is, are they imagining the world in a horizontal cosmology or a vertical cosmology? You know, do kami come down? You use down. Do we have heaven and downward language in the documents you're looking at when they're talking about kami? Or are kami coming from over there, here?
Right.
And the second question related to that, are kami peripatetic, or are they domicile somewhere, making these temporary appearances? That is, do they reside in heaven and then just do a quick, engagement here and then return? Or are they sort of Mononoke-esque wild boar who don't have a home, but they're just wandering through the forest all the time?
Right. All right, well, that's a great question. And it's frustrating that they don't really talk about that all that much. First thing we'd have to say is there are kami and then there are kami. Okay, so there are all sorts of different spirits, and I've written a little bit about this in terms of the types of spirits that you meet on the roadways. Usually are more related to, say, something closer to a demon than you would get from, say, the imperial mythology. There is some language that's used which says that they descend. One of the things that I find most fascinating about this period, though, is that changes again once you start to have the kami demanding housing. And it's very clear. I want you to build me a structure, and I want it to be like the emperor's palace. Right? They're flat out about it. So you have another of these just fundamental shifts in just the material basis and the siting of the ritual space, is that with these shifts in population, I really think the gods of Japan get set in motion. Okay, especially if you're looking at where tombs are built and the spirits of the dead. Okay, I mean, one thing that happens when you build a capital with 100,000 people, you have more people living together than ever before, but very quickly you have more dead spirits by you than ever before, right? And you also have more unburied dead than ever before. So the gods of Japan get set in motion, and then what happens is, you start building all of these shrines, and part of it, I suspect, is they are literally putting the gods in their place. And by doing that, by creating fixed ritual centers, a few things follow from that, a few other byproducts. One of which is, you ask about the personality profile. I actually don't think gods in 7th century or 6th century Japan had much personality. I mean, they don't care about human beings. Nobody cares about them. I mean, we read the Kojiken myths, and they seem to have some person, but basically they're just gods, right? But what you do find happen from at least the late 8th century, when now these kami it's just assumed they're going to have a shrine, they're going to have a building. It's not just a ritual space, it's also depicted as a residence. And a lot of the material offerings that are made annually from the court to these shrines, they're basically what you would need to set up a home. Okay? Women are getting weaving implements. I mean, female deities are getting weaving implements, et cetera, et cetera. So they are becoming more anthropomorphized. That's a byproduct, I think, of all of this. And I've forgotten the second part of your question. You were asking. They're becoming more domiciled, yes.
And it's sounding like the original idea was they are coming
Oh, yeah.
cosmology, but it suddenly becomes a more
Yeah, I actually, I have never asked myself this question in this way, but if I had to bet, I think they are seen as now occupying spaces here in this world. They've become much, much closer to us. And it's because they're closer to us that we piss them off more. And that's why you get so much more Tatari. And this is also, from the 9th century anyway, this is also why you get so much concern with kegare, right? You know, ritual pollution becomes a big deal because they're around here now. And that's also why, for the populace anyway, the main place you engage spirits is on the roadways. Because they're moving, and many of them are moving. And also, you know, it's here.
Hi, thank you for your fascinating talk. And I was struck by the what sounds like a military response to these ominous signs.
Yes.
So something anomalous happens, and the leaders, rulers link that to security concerns in the border area. That sounds like a modern state strategy to increase military budget, military spending. And but it's probably one of the
George
many.
W. Bush was actually a ritualist. Not many people know this, yeah.
But it sounds like it's one of the many kinds of responses right, in the repertoire for them. And they build temples to calm the fear and fear, you know, God or whatever. So I'm wondering, to what extent it was common to respond in that way, a military response, because there are many other ways. I don't know if they sacrificed goats or young children. I don't know what else they did, but if you could talk about other kinds of responses and the commonality of.
The military warehouses don't get going until the beginning of the 9th century. But they really, really do. It seems as if they almost were using these divinations. It was like an early warning system. I mean, you see them every 2 years, every 6 months. This is coming up, and it's not coming from one place. It's not being directed from the center. They just once you put in people's mind, if you ever hear a loud sound, if you hear something, say something, basically, you're going to get all sorts of reports, and they believe them. I mean, I think it's just really important to bear in mind that this is not all. We think of a lot of this as being maybe cynical manipulation, but I think they really do believe this is the way the world works. And if you believe, if you're adopting all these if you want to have a capital, you need to have all of these technological systems, which have as their best practice ritual dimensions. And they also are premised on notions of 5 phases thought. So if you buy that, then it's hard not to buy this, right? So in that sense, I think what we're probably seeing is when we get to the stage of, if you look at it from the popular level, it's just like, yeah, this is important. When it then gets to the level of interpretation, it may be that if they're really concerned about, if they're freaking out about what's happening with the Amishi, it's interpreted as this is, you know, unmitigated disaster maybe coming. That has to be the Amishi, right? So, or if it's anything that's the direction is indicated as north or northeast, Amishi. If it's south, southwest, Shilla pirates. Right, so there's a lot of play in any type of divination. It's not like automatic, and that may be what we see. So in the period of military tension, you get a lot more of this, but in other periods, it's not that.